Om Sarashavasamaramabham Shankaracharya Madhyamam Asmaracharya Paryantam Vande Guru Paramparam. Om. Be seated, please. Om. Good. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Sahavidyan Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om. Good. Nice to see you all today. Welcome to you. Welcome to those watching online. We begin our study today with some recitation beginning with verse 9. This is chapter 9 of the Bhagavad Gita. And as always, I'm sorry, verse 11. I misspoke. And as always, as I'm chanting, read the translation and then recite after me. Avajananti mam mudha, avajananti mam mudha, manushim tanumashritam, manushim tanumashritam, param bhavamajananto, param bhavamajananto, mama bhuta maheshwaram, mama bhuta maheshwaram, moghasha mogha karmano, moghasha mogha karmano, mogha jnana vichetasaha, mogha jnana vichet. Rakshasi masurim chaiva, Rakshasi masurim chaiva, Prakritam mohinim shritaha, Prakritam mohinim shritaha, Mahatmanastu mam partha, Mahatmanastu mam partha, Daivim prakritamashritaha, Daivim prakritamashritaha, bhajantyananya manaso, bhajantyananya manaso, nyatva bhutarim avyayam, nyatva bhutarim avyayam, satatam kirtayanto mam, satatam kirtayanto mam, yatantaschadridhavrataha, yatantaschadridhavrata, namasyantascha mam bhaktya, namasyantascha mam bhaktya, nitya yukta upasate, nitya yukta Jnana yajnena chapyanye, jnana yajnena chapanye, yajanto mamupasate, yajanto mamupasate, ekatvena prataktvena, ekatvena pratakte, bahudha vishvato mukham, bahudha vishvato mukham, aham kraturaham yajnaha, aham kraturaham yajnaha, swadhahamaham aushadham, swadhahamaham aushadham, Mantrohamahame bhajyam. Mantrohamahame bhajyam. Ahamagniraham hutam. Ahamagniraham hutam. Very good. Let's continue. So in this I saw in preparation for today's class, I saw a connection I hadn't really noticed before. Can we see the board, please? And that is that the topic that we've, where is the board? Board is here. The topic that we've discussed, these two perspectives, 2 points of views. In Sanskrit, drishti is point of view. So there is a higher drishti, paradrishti, and a lower drishti, aparadrishti. From the lower standpoint, we understand God, if we use the word God, to be immanent, here, now, pervading the world. We call that God Ishvara. Then from the other perspective, the paradrishti, the higher perspective, we say that that same God is transcendent, beyond the world. Immanent means here in the world. Transcendent means beyond the world. And we understand that reality to be both simultaneously. We use different language to refer to these two perspectives. From the lower perspective, we speak of saguna Brahma, Brahman with the qualities, gunas, quality of being creator, sustainer, destroyer, etc. And then from the higher perspective, we speak of the same reality from that higher perspective as being para Brahman, nirguna Brahman. Now, the reason I'm bringing this to your attention is, remember the title of this chapter? Jnana Vijnana Yoga. So there are many ways of interpreting these titles, and as you know already, the titles are not part of the Bhagavad Gita. Titles are added by later scholars. So that jnana and jnana means knowledge, vijnana means special knowledge, something unique about it. So certainly in this context, we could let jnana refer to the apara, the lower perspective of Saguna Brahman, and Vijnana, the special knowledge, as referring to the para perspective, the higher perspective of Nirguna Brahman. I've taught this for so many years. This is the first time I noticed that connection. Nice to see that connection. Okay, let's return to our text. The last two verses we just saw talk about the consequences of not understanding who and what that Brahman is, both Saguna Brahman, Ishvara, and Nirguna Brahman. That lack of understanding, and this is such an important topic. Allow me just to develop this just for a moment. The lack of understanding, ajnana, even in a worldly sense, seems to be at the root of so much human suffering. Why do countries go to war? If the ultimate consequence of war is detrimental to both countries, as it always is, right? So right now, Russia has invaded Ukraine. Obviously, Ukraine is suffering like anything, but Russia is not only suffering great military losses, they're suffering a lot on the world stage, so to speak. They're forcing themselves into a state of isolation. They're going to become, they use the term pariah nation. No one after this war will want to interact with Russia. Now, that's the case pretty much in every war, right? It's damaging to both sides. If we always knew that and thought about it and recognized it, no one would go to war. But it's the failure to recognize that fact and so many other truths that wars are driven not by this cold rationality. Wars are driven by emotions, as you all know. The United States has gotten into war driven by the emotion of fear. Why did this country, sorry to get on this long tangent, but I want to make this point about how harmful ignorance is, and then make that connection to the last two verses we saw in the last class. Why did this country get involved in the Vietnam War, which was a civil war? This country, history books show this country had no place getting involved in that war. Why did it get involved? Fear. That was during the Cold War. There was the fear that if communism took over North Vietnam, which it had already, and then if communism takes over South Vietnam, then what's next? They called it the domino theory. Some of you remember this talk from years ago. One country falls, and like a set of dominoes, another country. Anyway, my point is that ignorance-based fear drove that war in Vietnam. Ignorance is at the root of so many terrible things that happen in the world, and we could generalize to say ignorance is the root of all suffering. That is the Vedantic perspective. And Vedantic perspective because ignorance of your own true nature as Ch.9 Atma, ignorance of that inner divinity is what leads to your individual suffering. So both at an individual level and a social level, ignorance is the problem. Now, what about ignorance of Ishvara? This is our topic. Ignorance of Ishvara. This chapter is Jnana Vijnana, knowledge. What is the consequence of not knowing who and what is Ishvara? Certainly, anyone who says God doesn't exist, they do that because they've understood something? I find this remarkable. They proclaim God doesn't exist. Are they an expert on the topic? Have they undergone deep theological study to prove and establish that God doesn't exist? Such a statement is based on ignorance. And I happen to believe, you may not agree with me, I happen to believe that anyone who understands Ishvara as Sri Krishna teaches Ishvara, anyone who understands Ishvara properly will not be able to say God does not exist. I'm talking about the most hard-headed scientist or Marxist or whoever it may be, no matter who it is, if they understood properly, they wouldn't be able to say God doesn't exist. So ignorance is the problem, and these two verses that we just saw show the consequences of not knowing who and what is Ishvara. We've seen these verses, so we'll go on and pick up the thread with verse 13. With the contrast, the prior two verses are those who don't know. The next verses are those who know, or those who want to know. Let's see those verses. Mahatmanas mam partha, Mahatmanas mam partha, Daivim prakritamashritah, Daivim prakritamashritah, Bhajantyananya manaso, Bhajantyananya manaso, Jnatva bhutarim avyayam, Jnatva bhutarim avyayam. Mahatmanas tu. Mahatmanaha. Manaha because it's plural in number. There are grammatical rules. Not Mahatma, but Mahatmanaha. Those great people, Partha, O Arjuna, those great people who are, second line end, ashritaha, established. Established in what? You actually have to pick up a remote word at beginning of the last line, jnatva. And sometimes we have to jump around in a verse, as you know, these verses are not prose, And in the metrical verses, word order gets jumbled. Jnatva, having known. Now jump back up to the first line. Mam. Mam jnatva, having known me, Sri Krishna says. Having known me how? As being daivim, having known daivim prakritim mam. Having known me and my divine nature, daivim prakritim, having known me in my divine nature, having known me in my true nature, these mahatmanaha, those who know me, Sri Krishna speaks, who know me, those who are ashrataha, established in me, back down, jnatva, having known me, how? Bhutadim, as the adi, here meaning origin, creator. The creator of bhuta, of all beings, and the one who is avyayam, undecaying, immutable, eternal. Such people, in third line, bhajanti, they worship mam, they worship me, ananya chetasaha, with their minds being ananya, being fixed on me. Their minds are fixed on me. There's several things going on in this verse which are nice to observe. Sri Krishna is Arjuna's charioteer, and we've talked before about how many didn't recognize Sri Krishna's divine nature even after his Vishwarupa. I told you the story, I think in the last class or a couple of classes ago, where prior to the war, Sri Krishna revealed his divine nature in front of all the people gathered in the palace, and including Duryodhana. Duryodhana rejected the possibility of Sri Krishna's divine nature, thinking his Vishwarupa was some kind of magic trick. So he wouldn't accept it at all. The point is, Sri Krishna is referring to himself here, as he does in many places, most places in the Bhagavad Gita. Sri Krishna refers to himself not as Arjuna's charioteer. Sri Krishna refers to himself as the God of the cosmos. We explain this using that dream metaphor. I won't refer to it today, that lucid dream metaphor. Here's one interesting point to bring out here. Sri Krishna has a divine nature which may or may not be recognized. It's recognized if you have jnana and vijnana, title of our chapter. But if you have ajnana, ignorance, Sri Krishna's divine nature is not recognized. Well, it's not only Sri Krishna that has a divine nature. What about you and me? We say again and again, the nature of all beings, not just human beings, the nature of all beings is fundamentally divine. So not, of course, divine not in the same way as Sri Krishna is. Sri Krishna is an avatara of Lord Vishnu, an incarnation of Lord Vishnu. You and I are also divine in nature, but not in the same way as Sri Krishna, but still divine in nature, which is why, just to make a nice connection, Hindus greet each other namaste. The word it's literally namaha te, salutations to you. And the word namaha is a word we always use at the altar when we're engaged in worship. When we worship God with 108 names, namaha comes 108 times. Namaha te, salutations to you, again and again and again, 108 times during typical puja. So namaha is a word to mean salutations, literally I bowing. So namaha te, salutations to you. How can I say namaste, fold my hands and bow to you, unless you have a divine nature? This is the essence of the Hindu tradition. And that is, because you have a divine nature, I can say namaste and bow to you. If you didn't have a divine nature, I couldn't. It's just for fun. Interesting to contrast the Hindu greeting to the Western greeting. You shake someone's hands. Do you know the origin of this handshake? It's startling. So if you meet someone, how do you know he's not going to kill you? You know, he might be holding a weapon. Most people are right-handed. So if he holds out his right hand, he demonstrates he doesn't have a weapon. You hold out your right hand to demonstrate that you don't have a weapon. Next part is crucial. Grab each other's hands and don't let go so no one can grab a weapon. Honestly, that is the origin. I've kind of exaggerated it, obviously, but that is the origin of the handshake. It has the opposite point of view. It has such a negative, skeptical perspective on human nature, as opposed to the Hindu point of view, which presumes the divinity of the person. Your behavior may not be divine, but you are divine in essence. Therefore, namaste. So when Sri Krishna says, people don't recognize my divine nature, that applies not just to Sri Krishna. We don't recognize the divine nature of others. Could you go to war against others if you recognize their divine nature? Again, ignorance. And what to speak of ignorance of your own divine nature. So the problem is ignorance. The solution is knowledge, jnana and vijnana. Oh, just an anecdote about, actually I'll leave that aside, it doesn't fit. Then, next. Satatam kirtayanto mam, satatam kirtayanto mam, yatantascha vrataha, yatantascha vrataha, namasyantascha mam bhaktya, namasyantascha mam bhaktya, nitya yukta upasate, nitya yukta upasate. The next two verses describe those who know, to some extent, either know partially, know completely, or even those who have shraddha, faith in Ishvara. And what about those? So whether you understand, whether you have personally understood and discovered who and what is Ishvara, or even if you have partial understanding, as I think is probably true for most, or even if you have no understanding at all, but you have shraddha, some faith. In all of those cases, you are then able to worship Ishvara. To worship Ishvara is to recognize the greatness of Ishvara. We'll talk about the purpose of worship in just a few moments. So let's talk about those who worship Ishvara. What about them? Satatam, always, kirtayantaha mam. They are always kirtayantaha, praising mam, me, Sri Krishna says. Again, not praising Arjuna's charioteer, praising the God of the cosmos. Always. Satatam, always. This addresses a common problem, and that is if you think prayer is restricted to the time when you go to a temple, stand in front of an altar, if that's the only time you pray, or if you say a few prayers in the morning, if your prayers are very brief and restricted to just a few times during the day, what kind of devotion is that? Sri Krishna here talks about satatam, always kirtayantaha, praising. Which means, obviously, you can't go around engaged in a formal kind of prayer all day long, which is why we had so much discussion and why Sri Krishna taught so much earlier in the Bhagavad Gita about karma yoga. If you remember, one of the hallmarks of karma yoga is being able to maintain a devotional attitude while you're engaged in all your ordinary activities. So to constantly have that devotional feeling, that sense of connectedness to Ishvara all the time, satatam. This is what Sri Krishna is describing here. Otherwise, this term comes in my mind. My guru's words very nicely come. He says, if the only time you pray is when you go into a temple and then you stop praying the moment you leave the temple, you go, the way he describes it very nicely. He says, you go into the temple, you stand in front of the sacred forms, and you're just filled with this sense of love and awe and commitment, and he describes it as a spasm of bhakti. So you stand in front of the altar, and you have this spasm of bhakti, and as soon as you leave the temple, it goes away, leading him to describe such people as spasmodic devotees. So satatam here is the opposite of that, a non-spasmodic devotee, always praising Ishvara. Yet, second line, yatantaha cha, and yatantaha, striving. Striving how? Dridha vrataha, with firm commitment. Vrata here, commitment. Dridha, firm. Striving with firm commitment, striving to know. If you're going to stand in front of an altar, you see the sacred forms on the altar, and you know those sacred forms are representations of Ishvara, or vehicles through which we worship the God of the cosmos. So while you're standing in front of the altar, wouldn't it make sense to strive to understand the God of the cosmos who is worshipped through the sacred forms on the deity, on the altar? So yatantaha, they're striving, engaged in the spiritual practice, engaged in seeking to know who and what is Ishvara. Dridha vrataha, with firm commitment, and also namasyantaha cha, and also namasyantaha, they are bowing to Mam, me. Sri Krishna says they're bowing to me bhaktya, with devotion. And they are nitya yuktaha, always engaged. There, once first line he said satatam, last line he says nitya. He's really stressing this idea that devotion is not something to confine to particular times of day, but rather, ultimately, when you know who and what is Ishvara, let me be very, very concrete here. If you know Ishvara's presence in every single person, not just believe, but if you know Ishvara is present in every single person, then whenever you interact with someone, you'll feel like you're interacting with Ishvara. You don't interact with Ishvara only during formal prayer or during puja at a temple. You interact with Ishvara constantly through the day if you recognize Ishvara's presence everywhere, pervading the universe. We'll see that in the next verse. So those who are nitya yuktaha, constantly engaged with this prayerful attitude, upasate, they prayerfully meditate, they worship. They upasate, they worship me. Now, worship, an important question to bring up here. Sri Krishna uses a sense, worship. This whole verse is about worship. Worship is for whose sake? There's something fundamental here that we lose track of. We worship God. Tell me, does the God of the universe, the creator, sustainer, destroyer of all that exists, does such an Ishvara need your worship? You know, some people need a pat on the back now and then. You're doing a great job. You encourage them. You think Ishvara needs a pat on the back? What a great job you're doing. I mean, which is true. Ishvara is doing a great job, but it's not like someone who needs encouragement, who needs your praise. The point I'm making is that any form of prayer or worship is for your sake, not for Ishvara's sake. Think of someone you really love, love and cherish someone, usually a family member you love so much, and it's that person's birthday, and you ask, what can I get you for your birthday? And a person says, I don't need anything. You get them something anyway. Look at that. They tell you to your face, I don't need anything. You still go and get them a birthday present in spite of the fact that they don't need it. You need to give them something, you see? They don't need. You give the present not for their need. They've told you they don't need. You give the present because of your need to express your love for that person. That's the basis of worship. Okay, next. This is the second of two verses talking about those who worship God. Jnana yajnena chapyanye, jnana yajnena chapyanye, yajanto mamupasate, yajanto mamupasate, ekatvena prataktvena, bahudha vishwato mukham, bahudha vishwato mukham. Jnana yajnena cha api anye. Have to break those words apart. Cha api anye. Anye, others. Cha api, also. Others also. Second line, upasate. Others also worship, upasate. They worship mam, me. They worship me how? Yajantaha, worshiping. Worshiping how? And here's a crucial word in this verse. First word is jnana yajnena. Through a yajna, a offering of jnana, knowledge. This term is used in different contexts. They worship Sri Krishna, paraphrasing the first half. Sri Krishna says, others worship me through knowledge, to put it very simply. What does it mean to worship through knowledge? Well, that's interesting. I'm reading, I think I mentioned in another class, I'm reading this wonderful biography on Mahatma Gandhi by, I forgot the author then, it's by, actually it was in Satsang I mentioned. It's by this Ramachandra Guha, who was a great scholar and just really dedicated scholar. The biography, it goes on like 500-600 pages, it's huge. Why am I reading that night after night, page after page, reading through this huge biography, and you get the sense that by reading this huge biography on Mahatma Gandhi, the more what happens for me, the more I understand this person, and understand this person, by the way, also with his defects. Ramachandra Guha is a scholar, so he's not going to ignore the mistakes and defects. No human being is perfect. Gandhiji also made mistakes. He was a human being. He had a human side, so he wasn't just some kind of divinity walking on the planet. So by reading his story and getting so much detail about his life and his work, that knowledge increases one's respect, or I could even use this term, reverence. Your respect and reverence is increased through knowledge, which is kind of what we're doing right now, isn't it? In our study of chapter 9, we're not meeting here on Saturday mornings to become scholars in the Bhagavad Gita. What we're engaged in right now in our study of chapter 9 is understanding more deeply who and what is Ishvara, or to use the Vedantic term, Saguna Brahman, because that understanding deepens our sense of reverence and connectedness to that God of the cosmos. Further, there's a further point that Sri Krishna makes in the second half of this verse. He says, those others worship me through knowledge. What kind of knowledge? Different people understand Ishvara differently. And Sri Krishna does very nicely. He says, how do they understand the God of the cosmos? Some of them, ekatvena, worship God as being one. I'm going to come back to each of these words. So some people worship through knowledge, ekatvena, knowing God to be one. Others worship God through knowledge, pratakttvena, understanding Ishvara to be separate. Others worship God bahudha, in many forms, understanding Ishvara to be many. And of course, Sri Krishna is speaking from our Vedantic perspective, where others worship Vishwato Mukham, the one. It literally means all pervasive, but the Sanskrit has a lovely meaning. The one whose mukha, face, is Vishwataha, everywhere. The one whose face is everywhere. Everywhere meaning what? In your face, and your face, and your face. Any face you see is Ishvara's face. Or alternatively, take it from the other standpoint, one whose face is directed everywhere at all times. Your face has a direction. Whatever your eyes and nose and mouth are all on one side of your... What a weird concept. Suppose you had eyes here, and eyes on the right side, eyes on the left side, eyes on the back, eyes looking up, eyes looking down. In such a case, your eyes would look everywhere simultaneously. That's another way of understanding this term, Vishwato Mukham. It literally means all pervasive. Here, Sri Krishna has identified 4 different ways of understanding God. You can understand God as ekatvena, as being one. The God of the Bible is one. The God of the Quran is one. The God of the Torah is one. So, and Sri Krishna says others. So others meaning others who are not necessarily part of this Hindu tradition, others who are not Vedantic in their orientation, they can worship God ekatvena, as being one. Notice he's praising them here. He's not putting them down. He's praising those who worship that same, and obviously the same one God. I'll come back to that in just a moment. So actually Sri Krishna is talking about worshiping me. They worship me. To paraphrase this, we would say, I'll put some words in Sri Krishna's mouth, forgive me, and I think he'll forgive me. Sri Krishna would say, Christians worship me when they pray, Our Father who art in heaven. Now, remember, when Sri Krishna says me, he's not talking about himself as Sri Krishna's, as Arjuna's charioteer, nor even necessarily as an avatar of Lord Vishnu. When he says me, he's referring to himself as Saguna Brahman and even Nirguna Brahman, in both those senses. So with that in mind, when someone prays, Our Father who art in heaven, they are praying to that same, we'll use the term Saguna Brahman. Or if someone prays Allah, praying the same Nirguna Brahman. Others pray Prataktwena. They worship Ishvara, or Sri Krishna says they worship me, Prataktwena, as being separate. This could be a reference to the tradition of Dvaita Vedanta. We study here Advaita Vedanta, non-dualities, non-separateness. But there are plenty of others who follow Dvaita Vedanta, a teaching of being separate, which is the followers of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu fall in that category. They understand Sri Krishna to be the great God of all, dwelling in Vaikuntha Loka. Vaikuntha Loka is way far away. You're here. He is there. Sri Krishna is there in Vaikuntha Loka. You are here in this Manusya Loka, and therefore there is separateness between you, the worshipper, and Sri Krishna, the one who is worshipped. Again, Sri Krishna is not putting them down. He's saying they're worshiping the same God. Whether you worship Our Father who art in heaven, whether you worship Allah, whether you worship Sri Krishna who dwells in this Vaikuntha Loka, Vishnu actually in Vaikuntha Loka, Chaitanya taught Krishna in this Goloka Vrindavan. I think these are the terms used in the scriptures. Still separate. And then there are others, Bahudha, who worship the same Ishvara in many forms. Commonly Hindus worship God as Lord Shiva, as Lord Vishnu, as God as Devi, Saraswati, Lakshmi, etc., Hanuman, in all of these various forms. And many Hindus hold each of these deities to be separate, individually existing deities. That's not what Sri Krishna teaches, and that's not what we study here, but there are plenty who believe and accept that all of these are individual deities, individual gods, as it were. And again, Sri Krishna doesn't put them down here. What he's saying is, they're all worshiping me. So if you worship Jesus or Allah, or if you worship Krishna in Goloka Vrindavan, if you worship Vishnu in Vaikuntha Loka, if you worship Shiva on Mount Kailasha, if you worship Hanumanji, whoever you worship, you're worshiping the same God. And how could it be otherwise? There is only one Saguna Brahman. There can't be multiple. Look, the term used here is Vishvatomukam, all-pervasive. All-pervasive everywhere, all the time. Can you have multiple all-pervasive deities? Consider the metaphor that we use again and again for all-pervasive is space. Space is all-pervasive. Can you have multiple all-pervasive spaces? You can't differentiate. Both are overlapping. That doesn't make sense. There can only be one all-pervasive God. There can only be one. I'm just baffled when people who like to argue about religion, they say that Hindus worship gods different from the gods of the Christians and Jews and Muslims. I don't get that. How can you worship a different God when there is only one? I'll share with you a nice story. I use this story to teach children. You may enjoy this story. You also will find yourself in positions where you can help children understand how it is that Christians worship the same God as Hindus and everyone else. Here's a story. And generally with a group of children sitting in front of me, I would ask them, how many mothers do you have? The children think it's a strange question, but they know. Mom is one. Okay? And I ask, what do you call her? And children raised in this country, they'll call her Mom. They're not going to call her Mataji or, or something. So they'll call her Mom. Okay. I say, when your grandmother is visiting and she talks to your mother, does your grandmother call her Mom? They say, no. They call, and here they may say, no, they call her Beti, daughter. So Mom will call her, grandmother will call her daughter. And I ask the children, when your father comes home from work, does he say, hi, Mom, I'm home? And the kids laugh. No! What do they call, what does your father call Mom? Well, in this country, it's like Honey or something, some pet name. He calls her Honey. And then I says, and suppose Mom goes to the bank. When she's at the bank, will the banker call her Mom? No. They'll call her Mrs. So-and-so, Mrs. Patel, Mrs. By the way, think of the poor bankers who have Mrs. Balasubramaniam. They have to manage these long names. Problem, and they do. They do pretty well, I think. So anyway, then I asked the children, wait a minute, you said you have one mom. You call her Mom. Grandmother calls her Beti. Father calls her Honey. And at the bank, she's called Mrs. Balasubramaniam. One mom, 4 names. It's just a very simple way to help children understand. So if one mom can be called with 4 names, then one God can be called Jesus, can be called Allah, can be called Krishna, Shiva, etc., etc. Just this nice, simple story. A little cute. Nice for kids. They enjoy it. Okay. Big kids enjoy it too. All right. Okay. This Vishwato Mukham is what Sri Krishna is now going to expand upon. The Vedantic perspective of Ishvara is found, Chandogya Upanishad says it so brilliantly. Sarvam kalvidam brahma. Sarvam kalu, indeed. Sarvam idam, all this is Brahman. Saguna Brahman, Nirguna Brahman. All this is Brahman. That's that term, Vishwato Mukham, all pervasive. All this is Brahman. Sri Krishna is now going to expand on that. Aham kraturaham yajnaha. Aham kraturaham yajnaha. Swadhaham aushadham. Swadhaham aushadham. Mantroham evajyam. Mantroham evajyam. Aham agniraham hutam. Aham agniraham hutam. This verse is about yajna. Yajna, a fire ritual, fire sacrifice. And when different people attend these rituals, they'll have different perspectives. Here's an interesting perspective. Suppose a non-Hindu attends some yajna and sees a priest pouring things into a fire, sacred fire. Natural to us that non-Hindu will presume that fire is being worshipped. There's a common misconception. Making the offerings into that fire, you think fire is being worshipped. In fact, even Hindus have the same confusion. Fire is not being worshipped. If you're attending a Rudra Yajna, Lord Shiva is being worshipped, not fire. So you know the purpose of that fire. The role of fire in yajna is often misunderstood, but it's said so clearly in the very first words of the Vedas. The very first words of the Rig Veda, Agnim Ile Purohitam. 3 words. Agnim Ide, I worship fire. Purohitam, the priest. I worship fire, the priest. And you go more deeply into it, and you understand that when you hire a priest to do a puja or havan or yajna, homa on your behalf, the priest is doing the puja or homa. Is the priest getting the blessings? The blessings come to you, not to the priest. It's like when you use a spoon to eat ice cream, so the spoon doesn't eat the ice cream. The spoon is an instrument through which you enjoy the ice cream. In the same way, that priest is an instrument through which you receive blessings, and that fire is in the role of priest, the role of being an instrument. Specifically, whatever you pour into that fire, offer into that fire, is consumed by the flames. The flames and smoke go upwards, symbolically transporting your offerings to the God addressed. When you say Rudraya Swaha, this offering is unto Rudra, not fire. This offering is unto Lord Shiva. May this offering be unto Lord Shiva. That fire is an instrument of offering. The smoke and flames go upwards, symbolically conveying your offerings to the God of the universe. So don't make the mistake of thinking it's fire being worshipped. The deity being worshipped is addressed through mantras. The fire takes the role of a priest conveying your offerings to Ishvara. So notice the two people sitting at that ritual fire will have 2 very different perspectives. The non-Hindu will think fire is being worshipped. The knowledgeable Hindu will think that a deity being invoked through mantras is being worshipped. But there's a third kind of attendee. And that would be someone who really understands Sarvam Kalvidam Brahma, who understands all this is Ishvara. Remember my Guru's words, not that there's one Ishvara, there is only Ishvara, his words. Someone who understands there is only Ishvara will have a different perspective. And the perspective of only Ishvara is what Sri Krishna describes here. So the non-Hindu will think that fire is being worshipped. The Hindu will think that a particular aspect of God is being worshipped through these mantras, chanted at the time of making offerings. But someone who really understands deeply and profoundly will have a yet different perspective. The one who understands there's only Ishvara will have this perspective. And what is the perspective? Sri Krishna says, Aham kratuhu. I am, aham is the pronoun I. Sri Krishna says, Aham kratuhu. I am the very ritual. Aham yajnaha. I am the yajna. By the technical distinction here, kratu is a Vedic ritual, and yajna is the same kind of ritual, a fire sacrifice, but one that's not specified in the Vedas, one that's specified in other scriptures. Smarta karma, they call it. They make a difference between Shrauta karma and Smarta karma, if you care about these terms. Anyway, two different kinds of rituals, but Sri Krishna says, Aham kratuhu, I am the ritual. Aham yajnaha, I am that sacrifice. Swadha aham. When you're making offerings into the fire, some of the offerings are different kinds of grains and foodstuffs. So he says, Aham swadha. Swadha is an offering of food made unto the ancestors. An offering of food unto the ancestors is called swadha, according to the commentator, Madhusudana Saraswati. And he goes on to say, Aham aushadham. Aushadham here doesn't mean medicine, herbs. I am the herbs, anything that's grown from a plant being offered into the fire. Mantraha aham. I am the mantras being chanted during the performance of these rituals. Aham eva ajyam. Ajyam and ghritam are two Sanskrit words for ghee. Ajyam and ghritam both mean ghee, the most common offering into that fire. Sri Krishna says, I am the ghee. Just to make it complete. Aham agnihi, I am the fire. Aham hutam, and I am that which is offered into the fire. This is a paraphrase of back in chapter 4, Brahmarpanam, Brahmahavihi, Brahmagnau, Brahmanahutam. Many of you know that famous verse. So this is the same, I think chapter 4. This is the same idea being expressed here. A non-Hindu during that fire ritual will think you're worshiping fire. A educated Hindu will know that a particular deity is being worshipped as specified through the mantras, but someone who really understands Sarvam Kalvidam Brahma will know that everything here is a manifestation of Ishvara. Not one God, there is only God. There is only Ishvara. Okay, I think we can see one more verse. Pitahamasya jagataha, pitahamasya jagataha, mata dhata pitamaha, mata dhata pitamaha, vedyam pavitram honkara, vedyam pavitram onkara, riksama yajurheva vacha, riksama yajurheva cha. So Sri Krishna is in a mood, so to speak. He has just said, I am the fire, I am the offering, I am everything. And he goes on like this, I am. He says, the second word, aham, I. Pitta, aham. Most of you know Pitta, father. Pitta jagata, asya jagataha, of the entire world, aham Pitta. I am the father of the entire world, and not just father, mata. I am the father and mother. Many of you raised in a Hindu tradition will take this for granted. But think about those born outside the Hindu tradition. The idea of worshiping a female aspect of God is foreign to most people. And how sad that is to very narrowly imagine the God of the cosmos in only restricted to a male form or a male manner. So the Hindu tradition has this wide scope of understanding. And here's the general sense. This Saguna Brahman with the attributes of creator, sustainer, destroyer, the one that we generally call Ishvara, or in English, very loosely, God, the one who is Vishvato Mukham, all-pervasive. Suppose someone were to ask you, what is God's actual form? God's actual form is not a Krishna standing 4 feet tall holding a flute. God's actual form is not Lord Ganesha with the big belly holding various implements. God's actual form is not Lord Dakshinamurti on our altar, Lord Shiva as Guru, holding the Vedas in his hand, having the Chin Mudra in his right hand. All of these are representations of the one God. This is a trick question, obviously, you get that already. The trick question is, what is the actual form of that one God? Most of you can answer that easily. No form. Formless. And here again is something you may take for granted. The ancient rishis understood the one God to be formless, the reality of that God to be formless. Not an old man with a beard, not someone who was executed on a cross, not someone who dances around in Goloka Vrindavan, or lies at the bottom of the Milky Ocean on a snake, or is meditating on top of Mount Kailash. All of these are forms. The one God, Saguna Brahman, is formless. This is the wisdom of the ancient rishis. But they also understood that we can worship that one formless God in any number of ways. In a prior verse, Sri Krishna says, I am the fire, I am the offerings, I am this, I am that, I am this, I am that. There are several places in the Bhagavad Gita where it goes, here we're seeing a series of verses, I am this, I am that. When we get to chapter 10, he's going to go on for 12 verses. I am the rain, I am the sun, I am the moon, I am this, I am that, I am this, I am that. Because that Ishvara is everything. That one God is the underlying reality because of which everything exists. We've had this discussion before. Goes back to the dream metaphor. Everything that exists in your dream is a manifestation of you. You create the dream, you sustain the dream. When you wake up, the dream returns to you. Everything existing in that dream is a manifestation of you, the dreamer. Everything that exists here is a manifestation of Ishvara. But an Ishvara who is innately formless. But now we have the problem. Earlier we said worship is for whose sake? Not Ishvara's sake. Worship is for our sake. And now comes a very important principle in the Hindu tradition. And that is, many people have a hard time conceiving of a formless God. So if you have a hard time conceiving, how do you pray to a formless God? If you can, wonderful. Suppose it's difficult. No problem. If it's difficult to worship a formless God, then choose a form and let a form of Ishvara. Choose a form of Ishvara and let your worship be directed towards that particular form. Many of you know the term Ishta Devata. Devata is God. Ishta Devata, a chosen form of God. Chosen by whom? Chosen by you. What a unique tradition wherein you are given the freedom to choose, personally choose an aspect or form or representation of God that's meaningful and relevant for you. You get to choose. What other tradition says choose? Go ahead. Most traditions say this is the way we worship God, and if you don't worship God in this way, get out. You're not part of our tradition. So here Sri Krishna is speaking from this perspective of a tradition that empowers you to worship the formless God in a particular manner, with a particular form. For example, Asya Jagataha Pita, the Father of the cosmos. However you want to imagine the Father of the cosmos. Not only the Father, but Pitamaha, the grandfather of the cosmos. Fine, however you want to imagine that God as a Pitta, as a father, as a Mata, as a mother, as a Pitamaha, as a grandfather of creation, as the Data, sustainer. If you want to apply some words, the Pitta, the father, is Brahmaji. The Data, the sustainer, is Vishnu. If you want to apply that nomenclature, you get to choose which of these forms. Sri Krishna goes on to say, I am Vedyam. Vedyam, that which is to be known. Pavitram, that which is pure. Omkaraha, the one who's worshipped with the mantra Om. By the way, the translator here did a terrible job. I am the sacred syllable Om. By the way, who's the translator? Me. This is my translation. The translator did a terrible job. Some of our Sanskrit students will know Omkaraha is Punglinga, masculine and gender. What about Vedyam and Pavitram? Neuter in gender. Therefore, they cannot be Visheshanas, they cannot be adjectival to Omkara, as this translator incorrectly did. Minus. What does the teacher do with some red pen? Wrong. Anyway, it's wrong. So these are three independent words. It's not sacred syllable Om. Om is a sacred syllable, but Vedyam. Sri Krishna says, I am Vedyam, the one who is to be known. I am Pavitram, the one who is pure and purifying. I am Omkara, the one worshipped through the syllable Om, and many times Om is deconstructed into U, Ma. Representing Brahmaji, creator. U representing Vishnu, sustainer. Ma representing Shiva. Notice and U end up resolving into Ma. That's why Ma represents Shiva. Other ways of understanding Om also. Sri Krishna concludes by saying, I am Rik, Sama, and Yajur. First three of the Vedas, Rig Veda, Sama Veda, Yajur Veda. You can worship Ishvara in the form of that wisdom found in the Vedas. Notice Sri Krishna says, I am this, I am that, empowering us to choose aspects of Ishvara that are dear to us, that are relevant to us, that are meaning for us, and then to incorporate those aspects into our devotional life, to build a prayer life focused on a particular aspect of Ishvara that is meaningful and relevant to you, chosen by you, Ishta Devata. Okay, we'll see more in the next class. A couple of quick announcements. First of all, last week I had asked for some volunteers to help us with some bookkeeping projects here. I want to thank those of you who volunteered. It's wonderful to have volunteers do this work instead of paid staff. I have to be personal here. If this ashram were run by paid staff, I would feel like I'm living in a business place. This is my home. This is not a business place. So thank you for volunteering. Also, a second announcement. Tomorrow we have our bi-weekly, twice a month, satsang. So first and third Sunday. Satsang is a question-answer session. Tomorrow at 6 p.m. Come and join us for satsang. If it's not raining and the weather is warm, we'll sit outside. It would be nice to sit outside for satsang. If the weather's not suitable, of course, we'll meet here. We'll conclude with our prayers at the altar. Om Gananahan Tva Ganapatigam Avamahe Kaving Gavinam Upamashravastamam Jeshtarajam Brahmanam Brahmanaspataha Nashrinvan Utabasira Saranam Om Mahaganapataye Namaha Ishvaro Gururhatmeti Murti Bheda Vibhagine Vyomavad Vyapta Dehaya Dakshina Murtaye Namaha Vasudeva Sutam Devam Kamsachanuramardanam Devaki Paramhanandam Krishnam Vande Jagadgurum. Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinaha Sarve Santu Niramayaha Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu Ma Kaschid Dukkha Bhag Bhaveta Asato Ma Sadgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityor Ma Amritangamaya. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om Tat Sat.